So here's the quick argument against hereditarianism. Now, first of all, I should say there is absolutely no 100% evidence in either direction, because controlling for environmental factors to a total extent is virtually impossible. And it's so virtually impossible, it might never actually be capable of being done, because you can't run an experiment on this. Like, it's not possible unless you like raise a black and a white baby in a perfectly identical experimental environments where they interact with no other human beings and are taught via computer, so there's no effect on their race at all apart from their skin color, I guess. That'd be like the only way. And even then you'd have to do it for a bunch of people because you need averages and blah blah blah. So
0% of you are subscribed. Fix that.
That's obviously not very ethical, so we're probably not going to do that. But here is the argument that you can use. So, very often, the opening line for these race and IQ types will be, why don't you believe in evolution? What they'll essentially suggest is, hey, human populations were split up into different continents for thousands, if not tens of thousands of years. Why does it surprise you that we would evolve differently? Well, here's the problem. The features that did evolve between humans very visibly, such as hair texture, skin color, iris color, nose shape, and a few other things, are usually single genetic traits, or like 2 or 3 gene traits that are very easily affected by external stimuli. Your skin, your nose, your hair, this is all exposed to the elements. Your brain and your intelligence is incredibly polygenetic. It is vastly more complicated, which means far more genes would need to be influenced to affect the eventual outcome, to change your intelligence, your IQ. And B, your brain's in your skull, man. It's not being affected by the sun or the wind or the rain. It's not being affected by the difference in climate between the equatorial belt in Africa and like the cold fjords of Finland. Your brain's up here in your skull. It is insulated from the main environmental factors that would cause a genetic change to begin with. Does that make it impossible that there are genetic differences between black and white people in the brain? No. Nothing's impossible. Finland has no fjords? I'm sorry. My apologies. But it's very, 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 very less likely than your skin or your nose being changed. So that's usually the argument they'll use. Now, when it comes to the existing IQ gap, I think there's like a 12-point IQ gap between black and white people on average in America, I think, more or less. Now, the reason why this is A, not as big of a deal as people seem to think it is, and B, not necessarily representative of genealogy, is twofold. First of all, the Flynn effect. Every once in a while in the United States and in the rest of the world, our IQ tests are updated and made graded on less of a curve to account for the increasing IQ on average of the population. Over the past 100 years, the average IQ of an American has risen sharply, like really, really far. I think it's like 30 or 40, well, maybe not 30 or 40, hold on. Effect of Flynn effect. Yeah, hold on. The Flynn effect is a substantial the average test result, the standard deviation is set to 15 points, usually more recently the first, and 100. They would keep their average scores would be significantly above 100. For the Ravens progressive matrices, a study published in the year 2009 found that British children's average IQ scores rose by 14 IQ between 1942 and 2008. Okay, that it's probably around a 15 to 20 IQ point raise here in the United States, more or less. The actual amount isn't that important. Now, keep in mind, that means that when people talk about the inherent genetic inferiority of black people for their lower IQ, what they're saying is today the average black person is about as intelligent and has about as high of an IQ as the average white person did in the 1940s. You know, the boomers and the silent generation, the venerated true Americana, the people who went off and fought the war, though these people will probably think they fought for the wrong side. Those people. So when we're talking about black people's average IQ today, and it's so much lower than white people, we're literally talking about where white people were less than a century ago. So what caused that increase in IQ between the 1940s and today? Well, our schools got better. We listened to Beethoven in the womb, blah, blah, blah. Okay? Easy peasy. I don't know. There's a lot to it, okay? Essentially, these are environmental differences because no change, no evolution could explain that much of a difference in so short a time. Do you think technology advancement is the cause? That's definitely part of it, yeah. 100%, yeah. Nowadays, we're all fucking big brain. We got our phones. We can access information super quick. We can test our own IQ. 15 minutes, get sent the email, have to pay $20 to get the results for that. We can... Brains are muscles. We train them much more nowadays than we used to, you know? Probably back in the 1500s, the average white peasant in England's IQ would have been like 60 today. They don't need their fucking brains for anything. They lift hay and they set hay down. They shovel poop, you know? Brains are muscles. What are you going to do? Now, with all of that being said, so that's point number one. Point number two is we know for an absolute fucking fact of the matter, that there are still environmental factors that are lowering the average IQ of black people that are non-genetic, okay? They're massively lower rate of poverty, the neighborhoods they tend to be born in, and here's a big one, racism, believe it or not. It turns out, I know this is crazy, psychoanalysis has shown that people tend to do worse on tests if they are told and taught they will do worse on those tests beforehand. Their lack of confidence ends up influencing their actual ability. Which racial group in this country is repeatedly, through cultural osmosis, told they don't do well on IQ tests? There have been a bevel of tests and experiments and studies done to indicate that an improvement in environment leads to an improvement in the average IQ of black people. Now, it doesn't bring them quite up to par with white people because there are still factors we can't account for. Like, for example, racism they experience. That psych priming that they experience, we can't account for that. We can't change that. There's a lot of complexities there that we just can't account for. And for that reason, the scientific consensus on this issue is indeterminate. But even if it was a fact of the matter, that some portion of the difference between black and white people and their IQ was genetic, what the fuck would that change? Like what? So maybe black people have on average a 5 lower IQ. I don't believe this is the case, by the way, but if black people had on average like 5 lower IQ, that would mean they're about as smart as like the average white person in 1982. Like, that's your dad. That's younger than my dad. Like, what fucking difference does that make? Like, that's nothing. That's absolutely nothing. It's meaningless, you know? You'll notice, of course, that these hereditarians never seem to make the arguments that low IQ white people should be ostracized from whatever society they're trying to build. What they're essentially trying to do is use the IQ argument as a Trojan horse for an ethno-state by way of culture. The idea that black people and white people have different cultures by way of white people being intelligent and building civilization and black people living in mud huts or whatever. That's usually what they're signaling at. And it's just not supported. It's just not supported even remotely. The idea that people of different races have an inherent cultural predilection, just not factually not true. People have the cultures they're raised to develop. The idea that like lower IQ people on average produce worse culture, also definitely 100% not true. Because I bet you whatever environmental factors are stagnating the IQ of black people today were also affecting black people in Harlem back in the 1920s and 30s, and they still produced music, the blues and jazz, that ended up being the bedrock for American cultural exports for the next century. So clearly that difference doesn't seem to be influencing their cultural affinity that much. Yeah, jazz is kind of bog. At the end of the day, race is just not that useful of a determining or differentiating characteristic for geneticists or biologists. It's just not. That's why they don't use it. They talk about Kleins.
Your brain's in your skull, man. It's not being affected by the wind, the sun, or the rain.